All right, hello everyone. This week's video article comes from the November 1985 issue of Joe Weider's Flex magazine. Bev Francis is on the cover, and this takes place right after the 1985 Night of the Champions, which Rich Gaspari, a rookie pro, took a surprise second place. And the article is titled, "Did Gaspari Really Lose the Night of the Champions?" And it's written by Jerry Kindela. And here is the article. It says, for Rich Gaspari, the 1985 Night of the Champions was the long-awaited climax to one dream and the first stirrings of a new one. Anyone in the audience could see the flush of excitement fill his veins whenever he hit a most muscular, making him look something hydraulic. He had reason, several in fact, to be excited. Firstly, it was his revenge on certain parties in the bodybuilding community, those who fit neatly into the know-it-all category. They had predicted after his win at the World Amateur in November 1984 that Gaspari won't be seen again. Tonight they were choking, and the taste was bitter bile. Secondly, the brilliant changes he wrought in his physique blindsided the shadows cast his way just 7 months earlier. Upon seeing photos of Gaspari after the night, Lee Haney uttered in amazement, "Where'd that boy get that back?" Tonight, he walked in no man's shadow, himself casting one so large that it engulfed all but one other competitors. And finally, he knew he'd not only entered the pro ranks with distinction, the judges compared him so often he could barely sweat after prejudging, but he'd also put into spin the wheel that would take him into his next pro goal, the Mr. Olympia test. Rich Gaspari had arrived, but his pleasure would be sweet sour. When I stood up there with Al Beckles and they preceded the second place announcement by noting it was going to be a former Mr. Universe, I thought first was mine. Hell, I was the current Mr. Universe. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the man with the second place check was standing next to Albert. Then my name was called. It was like getting kicked in the skull by a jackass. Those who watched closely noted that Rich's physique seemed to deflate. The lats let out the pump, shrinking like punctured tires. The body lost height as the shoulders drooped. It was all momentary, but a brief change, and then he was back on stage. I didn't know what to do, he recalls. I wanted to be the sportsman, so I raised my check. I think that was okay to do. I wanted to congratulate Al, but I couldn't get to him. Christian was between us. Rich's girlfriend, Michelle DeBello, and his brother, Gaetano Vito, called Guy, sat but 3 rows from the stage. Michelle had a chokehold on Guy's biceps, waiting for the announcement. Both sat erect, muscles tense. With the announcement, Michelle fell against Guy's arm, a tableau in pain no more than 50 feet from Rich Gaspari's own momentary ride through anguish. Over the next few days, he would chew on the memory of this night, and as it is typical of his psychology, he would see it not as something negative, but rather as positive energy to pave the road toward his next dream. Rich is the youngest and only American-born child of Gilda and Stefano Gaspari, who hail from the small Italian city of Porto Cannon, unique for its native language of Albanian. Of course, both parents speak fluent Italian also. Stefano's drive to succeed and be independent was not unlike Rich's Herculean discipline. By the time he turned 17, Stefano was already an independent contractor and a mason in this town. In 1962, his biggest dream was to come true. He entered the United States, but only after a 5-year waiting period in Montreal, where he continued building and contracting. When I put foot in this land, USA, he says with strong conviction, right away I love it. This is my land. If somebody says something bad about the United States, I jump them. I tell you the truth. I'm more American than some Americans born here. Within 2 years after his arrival, Stefano became an independent contractor with his own business, but only after having been the construction foreman of New York's Americana Hotel. He still takes pride in that accomplishment. I worked from the first brick to the last brick. To this day, though in his mid-60s, Stefano continues to work with his hands. I do it best, hefting bundles of bricks that would cripple most men half his age. It's highly probable that Rich inherited his father's prodigious strength. At one point in his career, most of his training consisted of heavy work. One look at his knee ligament shows thick, sturdy constructions that allow him to squat incredible poundages. Even after he was born, shortly after Gilda and Stefano arrived in America, Rich showed evidence of his strength. Says Gilda, He bounced so much in his crib, we went through 3 mattresses. He destroyed them. She laughs at the memory. As strong as he was, Rich was routinely thrashed by the neighborhood kids. He was a small child and the perfect target for them. On more than one occasion, he'd come home in tears, eventually prompting the family to restrict his playing to the backyard. But cyclone fences cannot protect. One day, a neighbor called him over to the edge of the fence, and after mimicking Stefano's accent, popped Rich square in the face. Gilda realized something was wrong when her calls for Rich went unanswered. After a quick search of the yard, she began her hunting indoors, finally finding Rich under his bed. Blood had dried on his swollen face, but not before he scrawled "monster" and "I want to be a monster" on the wall beneath his bed. The dream to be big had taken root. Years later, on a local TV talk show after his Universe win, he would tell of the terror of his childhood, only to be called by some of the very perpetrators of his terror to be told that they couldn't believe that he'd said that about them. Rich laughed. Revenge was sweet. By the time he was 13, Rich was already a loner, and the iron suited this. His source of inspiration was old muscle magazines. At one point, he says, I became friends with someone whom I didn't particularly like, but his father had a tremendous collection of old magazines. I'd spend hours at his place flipping through the pages. And he'd dream of being a monster, like Leroy Colbert and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, and many of the very men he would come up against at the Night of the Champions. His parents, especially Gilda, thought his drive was obsessive, although she felt it would pass in time and he'd pursue more mainstream interests. That wasn't about to happen, however, as they learned following Rich's first year at a branch of Rutgers University. I told them, says Rich, that I planned on becoming a professional bodybuilder. Bodybuilding was going to be my life. That's when Rich's mother went on a campaign to change his mind. Routinely, she'd ask him why he wanted to do such a foolish thing. Why can't you be like your cousin, she'd query. He's an engineer and he makes good money. Because, he'd reply, I don't want to be an engineer. I want to be a bodybuilder. He believed that in time she'd come to accept his dream, and he admits that perhaps part of his drive to succeed in this tenuous profession was stoked by a desire to prove to her that he could do it. In effect, he turned a negative situation into positive motivation. Luckily, he had his older brother's unflagging support. Guy became his most sincere critic, particularly when others with good intentions would praise Rich's advances too easily and with too much gusto. Sure, Richie would get pissed off when I told him the truth, admits Guy, but after thinking it over, he'd see it my way. He'd realize I had his best interest at heart. And so it went until Rich's first big win, the 1983 Junior Nationals. For a few months, he rode on the wave of victory until his defeat that same year at the Nationals. The loss was hard to accept, so he decided to go for it all, moving to California to pursue fame, publicity, and the future. Much of this period of his life has been set for the record in the pages of muscle magazines, but what isn't known is his struggle to overcome his low morale. In January of 1984, Rich found himself at a photo session of the newly restructured Flex. A mere month had elapsed since his last Flex shoot, yet he ballooned in size. He was rejected as a model, and this cut deeply, causing Rich to reassess his position. Why did I move to California? To eat? Why am I eating so much? Is life always going to be so difficult? Where do I go from here? This was the first time I've been away from home, he recalled in a recent interview. I missed home desperately. Let's face it, I've been a spoiled kid, and here I was on my own, having to rely on myself. Then it hit me that it was up to me and no one else. As other writers have told it, Rich threw himself into a frenzy of training and dieting. At the same time, he developed a network of friends, a small group he could trust, including Lee and Shirley Haney. That has also been chronicled. What's interesting about this period is the occasional pain he admits to having felt when Lee would taunt him with, hey, fat boy, you'll never win, and hey, fat boy, you're dragging ass. I never let on to Lee, he says, how much all that hurt me at the time. I choked back the tears and hit my training with new vengeance. For of course, Lee was right. I had to think differently. I had to become a different person. Often Rich would grit his teeth and think, I'll show you, and squeeze out a few more reps. He continued to hold his own with Lee, absorbing as much as he could from the future Mr. Olympia, and at times he pushed Lee equally hard. It's also been reported that as an early riser, Rich would drive Lee and Shirley to near frenzy with his early morning shower singing. What they didn't know is that this habit sprang when he was a mere child. Besides being strong, his father says, Rich would love to sing as a baby, especially when we gave him a bath. He thought he was an opera singer, but instead of Caruso, he became the Dragon Slayer. His tenacity paid off with his 1984 wins at the NPC National and IFBB World Amateur events, a period followed by a new reality. Yes, he'd taken home the most prestigious amateur awards he could earn, but nothing happened. Though his family was pleased with their son's success, "My son Richie, he's Mr. Universe," his father would proclaim to anyone who cared to listen. Life did not change appreciably for Rich. Rich was also dismayed that few writers stressed his age, that he was the youngest Universe winner of all time, that he was entering the pro ranks at an unheard of age. To this day, he believes the situation should be rectified somehow. But more importantly, he believed his phone would ring off the hook. "I expected calls from everywhere. People asking me to perform, to give exhibitions, but nothing happened," he says. That's when he decided that one must earn everything, a lesson his father's life bore witness to. With his brother Guy, Rich began a letter campaign to promoters across the country. Essentially, he told them, "I'm available, and here's my number." Though back home in New Jersey by this time, Rich turned to what he learned during his 1.5-year stay in California. One of the most important things was, you've got to plan ahead in steps and increments. There must be small strategies leading to the big one. He needed transportation, and it dawned on him that a local automobile distributor might see value in him. He mailed countless letters to distributors in his area, stating, in effect, that he was the current Mr. Universe, and, well, he had an offer they couldn't refuse. Distributor after distributor passed on his proposal until he received a reply from Mitsubishi Dodge. Yes, they were interested in talking. Today, Rich drives around in a 1985 midnight black turbo Starion, a piece of machinery loaded from front to rear deck spoiler. His end of the bargain with Mitsubishi calls for Rich to give 2 exhibitions per year for the distributor for the next 5 years. Not bad for a flashy $18,000 plus automobile. Around the same time, in early January 1985, Rich put his next major plan into operation, preparation for the Night of the Champions. He no longer felt constrained by specific weight class limitations, and he decided to go all out for his pro debut in June. He'd been smart following the Universe, being careful not to balloon in weight as he'd done in the past after a contest. I learned the wisdom of Joe Weider's dictum that several successful champs don't put on more than 10 to 15 pounds between contests. Lucky for him, he was always in near contest shape, for guest appearances and exhibition dates slowly began to fill his calendar. Appearing in top shape at even the smallest exhibition became a priority. "I wanted promoters and fans to say nothing but the best to me," he says of his strategy. "Word of mouth is important in this business, and I was determined to please." At this point, he received an invitation from the IFBB Federation in Tahiti. They would foot the bill for a 2-week sojourn there. Would he be interested? Would a cannibal turn his nose up at a freshly roasted morsel? In April, he deplaned to a hospitality he'd never encountered before. The Tahitians had also invited Lynn Conkrite for the same period, and when she met Rich, all she saw was this awesome young kid who was determined to become one of the world's best bodybuilders. His drive was incredible, she says. Tahiti is hot, yet Rich insisted on training twice a day, in addition to giving assorted lectures and exhibitions. And amidst all the food that was available, I couldn't believe the dietary discipline he maintained. What she may not have known was that Rich came down with Tahiti's version of Montezuma's Revenge. "I started dropping weight too quickly," he says. "And can you imagine what it felt like to do an ab crunch or a most muscular for an audience?" 1 week after leaving Tahiti in near rip condition, of course his sponsors there loved his shape, Rich was in the South Pacific again, this time in Hawaii for Donald and Kathy Chang's Hawaiian International Invitational Championship. One competitor described Rich's abs as giant raviolis. As Kathy put it, "We've never had anyone appear at this event in such excellent shape." The normally laid-back Hawaiians agreed when Rich stepped on stage and went into a series of mind-boggling muscle shots. It was at the end of the contest, yet his performance brought the languid fans to their feet with each pose he cranked out. Yes, he learned to promote himself well. "I'm a product," he says, taking the lead from Tom Platz. "It's a matter of pride and honor and future that I appear at my best." That's not to say he isn't taken by the lure of travel. Upon his return to New Jersey after a month on the road, his first major trip abroad, Rich toted an extra suitcase full of South Pacific trinkets, including a valuable black pearl he purchased for himself in Tahiti. He wears it with distinction, like a badge, as if he were bodybuilding's first yuppie. After the Universe, another major event occurred in his life. Following 18 months of self-imposed singledom, Rich found a girlfriend, Michelle. And she came into his life at a crucial juncture when he left his small support network in Los Angeles. The last few weeks before the Night of the Champions were filled with moments of sheer anguish for the handsome Italian who turns female heads regularly. For no reason at all, he confides, I'd be overpowered by strange emotions. Maybe it was diet or training stress or something else, but I find myself breaking down. He talks slowly, unusual for this East Coaster who generally speaks loudly and rapidly. It's as if he's embarrassed to admit the memory. Whenever this would happen, Michelle would take me through the situation. She gave me support and compassion. She knew instinctively what I needed. This is another change in Rich, who's always acted as if nothing escapes through his thick hide. It's a brave admission, especially since many other bodybuilders experience the same situation before a major contest, but don't have the macho to express the reality for the record. Generally, a wary one will say something like, hey, please don't write that. It makes me look bad. Rich isn't worried about anything except appearing as he really is. When he stepped on stage at the Night of the Champions, he immediately became a homeboy, the local favorite, a new hero for the East Coast. Sure, as Leary Carrasco's report reveals, Rich didn't take the #1 slot. That went to the ageless one, Albert Beckles. But that doesn't mean Rich hadn't won, as he came to realize during the next few weeks. Immediately after show, he was besieged by calls from well-wishers and supporters, and his mailbox was stuffed regularly. Just 1 week after the show, he was in California for a photo shoot for Flex, still holding his peak, though 2 pounds over the 213 he tipped the scales on at the Night of the Champions. At one session in World Gym, Artie Zeller exclaimed that what Rich had accomplished since his November Universe win may have been unprecedented in bodybuilding. I can't believe, said Artie, he's gained 23 pounds of muscle since then. Any bodybuilder who gains 4 pounds of muscle during the course of a year can be proud of himself. I don't know how Gaspari did it. Of the process, Rich says, I didn't really gain all that muscle. I simply didn't lose any for the show. For another shoot, Flex managed to obtain a classic 1956 Buick Century convertible. The car's owner, a film producer with several movies to his credit, including the moneymaker Fade to Black, co-produced with Ron Hamady and grossing approximately $20 million in rentals, mused about doing a documentary about Rich's training for the Olympia. Producer George Braunstein admitted that the project would be a long shot, even by Hollywood standards, but that it held some possibilities. Rich took the comment for what it was worth, a grand compliment at the time, and then his eyes narrowed and he said, I want Haney. I love the guy, but I want him. And that's where his sights are set, Brussels. When it was pointed out that many of the champs he'd beaten at the Night of the Champions had been merely tuning up, that they hadn't appeared in their best Mr. Olympia conditions, Rich replied, sure, I realize that, but I don't dwell on it. Knowing that'll make me work that much harder because I turn all negatives into positives. You should know that by now. Remember, once I was a skinny punk, then I was a fat boy. Watch for me at the Olympia. I'm not a loser. All right, the end.